My Lords, the last year or so has seen a troubling increase in intolerance and the so-called cancel culture. And I think many of us have been at best naive about what is happening at universities and amongst activist groups. A number of recent cases have focused on attempting to silence those who are gender critical or biological realists. Many of them are women, from MPs Rosie Duffield and Joanna Cherry to academics Raquel Rosario Sanchez, Professor Joe Phoenix, and then barrister Alison Bailey, Maya Forstater, tax expert, forced to take legal action to protect their reputations and livelihoods. Artists like Jester Wall, and only this week the dancer Rosie Kay, who has been forced out of the charity that she set up for daring to express her views that biological sex is real. These are women who have been intimidated, harassed and bullied for simply expressing opinions that everyone once took for granted, that women are adult human females and that sex, biological sex, matters. As many others, I have mentioned Professor Kathleen Stock, who has been hounded out of her job at Sussex University for her belief that biological sex is binary and immutable. Belief, I'd call it a scientific fact, a fact of life, in fact. Professor Stock was accused of making trans people feel unsafe. Unsafe? But why should scientific facts make anyone feel unsafe? Trans people do not all think alike. What about those who agree with Professor Stock? People like Dr. Debbie Hayton. How do they feel? Debbie Hayton is a transsexual who transitioned in 2012. She's written extensively in the press, and I find her perspective rather refreshing. She has defended Professor Stock and written in support of JK Rowling. She has little time for what she calls gender identity ideology. Her views could be summarised in a line from one of her own articles. Gender identity is bollocks. You either have them or you don't. It's fair to say that Hayton divides opinion with views like that, but should she not have the right to express them? Not according to the transgender thought police. That's what Hayton called them, and she may have a point. But while they may be policing thoughts, they are not necessarily transgender themselves, but they use transgender rights to attack and cancel others. You do not need to search too far on social media to observe the hate directed at Hayton, presumably for being the wrong sort of trans person. Quotes, Lord Haw Haw Hayton, the quisling wannabe. Debbie Hayton is a monster, a completely twisted human being. Sadly, abuse like that is all too frequent, as are death threats. She gets those too. Debbie Hayton is a traitor to her community and should be afforded the proper respect as such. That tweet continued with images of 3 large knives. But while her attackers hide behind anonymous profiles, Hayton campaigns under her own name. She is a science teacher, and it's not difficult to identify the school where she teaches. And she's therefore vulnerable to being cancelled not only on social media but in her employment. The chatter on Twitter shows that pressure is being applied. Quotes, it amazes me that Hayton's employer still employs her in any capacity in education and that the relevant anti-terrorist policing department hasn't acted. Someone else then added, they're as transphobic as she is. I've tried to complain a few times and they just said she's concerned. A few times. Earlier this year, Hayton added her name to a letter criticising the decision by the Women's Prize for Fiction to longlist a book written by a trans woman. One of her opponents tweeted directly at the school where she teaches and said, how do you continue to endorse Debbie Hayton when she's happy to sign a truly transphobic letter? Your continued support for her is transphobic. Transphobia. I commend Hayton's courage for being prepared to say what she thinks. I also want to praise her school for standing firm. As we've seen in many cases, other employers have responded to such criticism rather differently. When we ask ourselves why more people, and indeed more trans people, do not speak out in support of those like JK Rowling and Kathleen Stock and defend the rights of women, maybe we have an answer. Campaigning might be part and parcel of a democratic society, but it rarely pays the bills and puts food on the table. This debate is not a dispute between women on one side and trans people on the other. No, Stock and Hayton appear to be on the same side, and they're both attacked for making rational arguments. But it's not just abuse on social media, if that were not bad enough. Their freedom of speech is threatened in part because their livelihoods are threatened. And that, my lords, is wrong. Professor Stock was hounded out of her job at Sussex. Hayton hangs on to hers. But what are we doing as a society to protect their right to speak and not be punished for it? And my final point. Criticism of gender identity ideology is not an attack on trans people. It is not transphobic to support women's rights. Trans people like Debbie Hayton make that very clear. Hayton has described it as an authoritarian, quasi-religious cult, and one where you must believe or be thrown out. And as she points out, Riley, I am an apostate. We need to do better for Dr. Hayton, Professor Stock, and anyone who is willing to stand against an ideology. The rights of women and the safeguarding of children may depend on it.